Welcome, everyone. While we wait for more participants to flow onto the platform, on screen is the ERIS content disclaimer. The webinar will be recorded and available on the website in the next few days. I would also like to mention that there will be time dedicated for questions and answers with the panelists after the presentation. Please enter any questions you have in the Q&A section of the platform rather than the chat section, as we may not see them there. All right, let's get started. I'm Scott Davis, Senior Vice President, Industry Engagement for ERIS, and the host for today's webinar. ERIS is an environmental risk, property data, and information service company that provides high-quality reports to help environmental professionals review and analyze critical data and historical products to make clients' work lives easier. So thank you for joining today's session. Dry Cleaning Sites, Part 3, is time to remediate. Dry cleaners were once a key component to retail centers in urban areas. Historically, they used perchloroethylene as their main solvent, contaminating the environment. Consequently, these businesses turned into environmental liabilities. Cleaning up these sites financially burdened landowners and developers, and indoor air quality concerns exacerbates the challenges. Moreover, dry cleaners often have limited space, restricting remediation options. We're truly fortunate to have Michael Marcone and Larry Schnapp with us today. For over 25 years, Mike has been a principal with In Control Technologies, helping clients navigate the complex world of environmental regulations and site restoration. Mike has vast experience in assisting dry cleaners and property owners who have historical or current dry cleaning plants address the environmental contamination associated with historical waste management activities. Also joining us today is Larry Schnapp, an environmental attorney based in New York City with 40 years of experience. He has chaired numerous New York State Environmental Law Association committees and has served on several ASTM task groups, including chair of the legal subcommittee for ASTM 1527 task force for 2013 and 2021 revisions for the Phase 1 standard. Larry is also an adjunct professor of environmental law at New York Law School. Mike, we'll start with you.
All right. Thank you, Scott. And it's such a pleasure to be back again for our third visit. If you remember or participated in our first two sessions, the first session was really focused on dry cleaners, the history of dry cleaning and the environmental concerns around dry cleaner. And then the second presentation really focused around the legal side of the environmental situation with dry cleaners, including liability, real estate transaction liability, and managing that. And now we're down to sort of the final, or the third presentation, the third in a series, which focuses on the remediation or the cleaning up of the dry cleaner. I think a lot of times we forget that that the dry cleaner remediation is not only the actual remediation, but there's a significant legal component to that as well, regulatory component. So today we're going to talk a lot about remediation, but we're also going to take time to sort of review the regulatory framework and liability that's still there, even though dry cleaners may be remediated or sort of cleaned up. And so with that, just a quick overview of what we plan on talking about. We're going to do a quick review of the dry cleaners, kind of session 1, and a little bit of session 2. And then we're going to move into discussing the remediation of the dry cleaners. And again, it becomes a balance between selecting remedies and also balancing the regulatory requirements. And again, Larry's going to discuss some of these at the end of the presentation. So what chemicals that are used? Again, a review from the last session. The primary chemicals in the dry cleaning industry, tetrachloroethylene or PERC or PCE, it was the leading dry cleaning solvent through the 50s into the 1950s to the 1990s. And then it started converting back to Stoddard solvent And today we have several alternative solvents that are being used. Really, the focus today is on the tetrachloroethylene, perchloroethylene, hydrocarbons. I don't want to diminish them as being a potential issue, but it is not very common. In fact, I would say it's rare for a Stoddard solvent dry cleaner to have a significant soil groundwater contamination. There still could be vapor issues, but predominantly the conversation today is going to focus on the PCE and the TCE. Now, just a quick review. Again, we have to keep in mind that there is a number of regulatory components that regulate the dry cleaning industry. And when you step into remediation, you can't just ignore these regulations. And I think Larry's going to spend some time going through there. For example, the hazardous waste management requirements are a big component of technology selection and making sure we're managing this. And again, I'll leave that to Larry. And then also taking into consideration state and local requirements. And they need to be a component that we normally consider. So the hard facts, the EPA studies along with state coalition have determined that 75% of the approximately 30,000 dry cleaners have contaminated the environment. I mean, simple math tells me that I've got probably around 25,000 dry cleaners out there that have some level of contamination. This does not include historical dry cleaners that are no longer in existence, and they estimate the number of sites probably as high as 90,000. Dry cleaners are a major contributor to soil and groundwater contamination. That's a fact. I still occasionally review the phase 1 ESA that fails to identify the dry cleaner as a significant potential environmental concern. Over 150 dry cleaner sites are listed on the federal CERCLAS database. So these are federal Superfund sites. And I think currently you'll find that they are probably dominating the state and federal Superfund sites. So PCE waste streams, where does the contamination come from? Mainly from spent PCE and also the solvent spills itself. And there are some arguments that once it becomes spent PCE, it should be a listed waste. And then the solvent itself, whether or not that constitutes a listed waste where the mixed in rule comes in, these are things you need to consider. Still bottoms, again, would be a waste. Spent filter cartridges, and then we have to deal with PCE solvent contaminated water or separator water that's part of the dry cleaner. And then waste streams from perc hydrocarbons are hazardous. So the waste streams themselves tend to trigger that. So we need to also incorporate that into our conversation of technology selections. Just a real quick look at the dry cleaner itself. We have the dry cleaning machine, again, a very common source, minor spills and releases. A lot of times the separator water, which is a water that's produced by the dry cleaning machine, is poured down the drain. And again, leaks in the plumbing, goes into a lot of communities require lint traps. These lint traps catch the fine fibers off of the wastewater from the dry cleaner or from the laundry. And it also becomes a sinkhole to collect perc and contamination, again, typically made out of concrete, which the perc moves through. And so we need to consider these when we're trying to look at the spots that need to be remediated. We also need to really take into consideration the fate and transport of the chemicals of concern that we're talking about here. So the perc that we're talking about will travel through the environment as a napple down into the groundwater. It's dense, it's heavier than water. It tends to flow into the groundwater. Flow can stop at the groundwater contact, and then it can also stop in areas of lower permeability. And then we have the starting of a dissolve phase problem. And these create vapor issues. So now we have a plume that has a high potential for vapor intrusion. And we need to consider all of these when we're looking at technology selection. So that is the short review of session 1. And now we'll move into discussion of the remediation and remediation technologies. If we just look at the technologies, there's not a lot special. These are all common technologies that are used: soil excavation, removal, soil vapor extraction, bioremediation, air sparging, pump and treat, chemical oxidation. These are all things that happen on industrial sites, but they become very unique when it comes to the dry cleaner. And what we have to do is keep in mind that the dry cleaner has its own particular characteristics that make remediation a challenge in itself. Number one, and probably the most significant issue of all, is limited funding. The dry cleaners themselves, typically, it's a very low margin business, and they don't generate a lot of revenue to be able to afford to clean up the mess that they created. Also, some are state funded, and a lot of the states have very limited fund, and we got to keep in mind that most states now have either closed the access to the fund or have very limited restrictions on who gets to use the money. And because of that, now lending companies are becoming less and less favorable of participating in the state-funded programs. We have to keep in mind that the dry cleaner site itself is very small, and trying to remediate within the confined space of a dry cleaner brings along its own unique challenges. The good news is the soil issues, typically, I know someone out there is going to tell me they have a dry cleaner site that has a huge soil plume, but typically the footprints are small in soil, roughly about 20 by 20 feet, maybe a little bit bigger. However, the groundwater is where we get the big problem, because the solvents can move rapidly through the groundwater unit, and of course the transmissive unit itself. And now with the new issues associated with vapor intrusion and migration into neighboring tenant spaces and even neighboring properties becomes an issue. So let's focus a little bit on soil. The soil issue itself is, the soil remediation complexity is really situated based on the smallness of the facility in which I have to work within. I typically have very limited space. Now, the advantages is if I have a dry cleaner site that's been torn down, or the property's under redevelopment and the building's gone away, then I've got a wide open space. But a lot of times the dry cleaners themselves are relatively small. The other thing, the typical technology that we look at are excavation with limited treatment, maybe chemical oxidation, biological amendments, offsite disposal versus placement back into the excavation. Now, the big thing here is, and again, we'll talk about this later, I'm not going to expand on this, but you have to be very careful about waste classification when you're doing treatment, that your treatment method doesn't trigger placement, and you end up becoming a treatment facility. You also have to keep in mind confined area. I was trying to find a picture to put on the slide. A lot of times the excavation equipment is modified, and so we modify the equipment to go in there to work in a small space. And again, to have to keep in mind that those are the things. Groundwater issues. With groundwater, we have to balance between plume size and the transmissive unit characteristics. For example, sands and gravels, are much easier to get in and remediate. The downside is the groundwater moves much faster through the sands and gravels, and we have much larger plumes and more extensive areas that have to be remediated. Then we get into silty clays, not as transmissive. The plumes tend not to be as big, but now we have difficulty in either getting products into the ground to remediate it or get the product out of the ground. Fractured shales, limestones, chalks, again, become difficult. Even weathering in the formations become preferential pathways that have to be dealt with. And then we add to that the difficulty of DNAPL. The PCE and its degradation products are a DNAPL. And while we don't often find DNAPL on dry cleaner sites, the EPA screening criteria for DNAPL is a good tool because a lot of these sites have micro droplets that are caught up in the interstitial spaces of the soil, and they're present. They're hard to discover. The dry cleaning surfactants, the soaps and stuff, tend to increase the solubility, and then we have to be worried about vertical migration. And so the groundwater limitations that affect this are, again, access to the source area. Again, the DNAPL issues, I can't tell you how many remediation projects we were involved with, estimated the mass of dry cleaner solvent in the groundwater, started up a groundwater extraction program and treatment, and we pulled out 50 times the amount of dry cleaning solvent than we estimated to be in the formation, and we still hadn't achieved cleanup standards. Why? Because of these micro droplets of DNAPL that are bound up in the soil that are hard to remove. And so they create a long-term source if they're not handled or properly treated. And they also create opportunities for vertical migration. The low permeable transmissive units also tend to hold the DNAPL as well, but the advantage is the plumes tend not to be as extensive. The last two bullets, I think, are critical. Poor site characterization. After my first presentation, I got a couple of calls from people talking about things like doing vapor sampling and vapor points. These are all excellent ways. I cannot stress enough, we have to have proper characterization of the plume, not only the chemistry, the chemical data, but we also need to have biological data if we're going to select technologies that rely on bioattenuation, natural attenuation, or enhanced bioremediation. So the data that we collect also needs to support the technology development that we're choosing for the site. Then we bring in the newest and latest and greatest, I guess, concern that we have in the last 5 or 7 years is vapor intrusion. Again, the issue with vapor intrusion is the migration of the contaminant mass. These are volatile compounds from the groundwater plume up through the vadose zone and into buildings and structures, because the structures themselves can act as a pseudo vacuum to pull the vapors into the structures. So some of the issues that we deal with, again, are a poor understanding of the source, a poor understanding of the fate and transport, along with the vertical migration, indoor air. And the vertical migration in this time is not upward migration. I mean, it's not downward migration, but upward migration. And then understanding the indoor air issues, and then looking at remedies such as vapor barriers versus source elimination, long-term source handling. So I always like to try to, when I'm developing a remedy for a site, is look at the long-term versus the short-term remedies. We want to be able to get some short-term achievements, to help reduce mass, to reduce the amount of contaminant mass that's out there that we're having to deal with. And this is generally done through source removal, soil excavation, balanced with some sort of groundwater remedy. And we've developed and used a variety of technologies, including some forms of groundwater extraction along with in situ technologies. And so the groundwater extraction helps improve the injection of the in situ technologies while providing some benefit in return. Again, we use chemical oxidation in the source area, in the soils to remedy the soils, and potentially carbon solutions for chemical absorption. These are new technologies that are coming out that are proving to be quite successful on projects. Long term, we look at things like enhanced biological treatment, where we use a number of different in situ technologies. They are emerging. I would not necessarily consider them emerging technologies today because I think they're well proven. Again, my caution, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is make sure that your technology meets your site conditions. Again, we can also use chemical oxidation and reactive barriers to provide more long-term solutions. Now, I like to look at these from aggressive technologies. Again, the most aggressive of them all is source removal, source area removal, or soil excavation. And that's simply what it is, excavating the soil. When we're doing this inside a dry cleaner, there's a number of health and safety concerns that one needs to consider whenever they're dealing with the remediation. Again, vapor that's generated during the soil excavation can pose a health and safety hazard for construction workers that are on site. Pump and treat, dual phase soil vapor extraction. Again, these are technologies that generally we use as an add-on to another technology. They shorter response action time, typical. Unfortunately, they're expensive, have high operation and maintenance costs, meaning that you have to be on site on a rather frequent basis. So there's a lot of labor expense expended in this. And I like to reserve these typically for the highest risk sites or sites that have critical development schedules. So sites where we've torn down a building and getting ready to build something back. But more importantly, we're using these technologies to help enhance the in situ chemical injections or biological injections that we're doing. So let's look at the longer term remedies. These would be, again, source area removal, ideal for property redevelopment. It also helps reduce vapor intrusion, vapor infiltration, which we'll talk a little bit. And then in situ groundwater response actions. Now, the advantage of the in situ chemical oxidation, enhanced bioremediation, or carbon solutions that are commonly employed on the dry cleaner sites is these tend to have a longer effectiveness. I know that the in situ chemical oxidation, a lot of it is instantaneous in the reaction process, but the long-term effects seem to be there after the injection process is over. Enhanced bioremediation, and again, carbon solutions that are injected in the ground provide more of a longer-term way of looking at this. Now, I'm going to say probably today, the most commonly employed technology is enhanced bioremediation. There is still quite a bit of monitored natural attenuation, but even I think some of the monitored natural attenuation occurs after some enhancement in the biological treatment on the site. Again, in my opinion, and what I've seen on the projects that we've done, the effectiveness of the technology is about 3 to 5 years. And so when we go out there and do a appropriately designed enhanced bioremediation project, that technology generally has a 3 to 5 year lifespan where it's continuing to affect the mass contamination in the groundwater. It allows the response actions to work over a longer period of time with minimal O&M. And for fund-stracted parties, this becomes a potential option for them to spread out the expense and allow them to be able to cover the cost. Again, it continues to actively address groundwater with minimal additional cost because the microbes are in the ground doing what the microbes do. And we just need to make sure that the environment is conducive to what they want to do. So the enhanced bioremediation relying on natural processes already active in the environment. That's one of the, again, that's the monitored natural attenuation. But again, we look at two different types of enhanced bioremediation, the aerobic technologies. Again, our experience, I'm just telling you what my experience is. The aerobic technologies tend to have a shorter effective lifespan, 6 to 12 months. And you are reintroducing these microbes over repeating them over a shorter period of time. The injections that we've used, Pseudomonas bacteria, basically the efficiencies are derived by making sure we have the right bacteria that we're injecting. So the companies that provide these generally do intentional culturing, so they do selective culturing of the microbes. And some of the problems is with this technology is we're injecting them into environments that's not necessarily conducive. So the other thing is we have to make sure that the environment has a high dissolved oxygen concentration. And a lot of times that's not the case because of the other factors that are associated with the dry cleaners, like the laundry water tends to deplete the dissolved oxygen. So it becomes a balance. However, we have had success on some sites using the Pseudomonas bacteria to remediate the site. The anaerobic technologies, I think, are the more common ones that we see out on the market, and they work through dehalorespiration using Dihalococoides bacteria. Most rely on using some proprietary substrate for an electronic donor. Just because you hear somebody injected molasses or some sugar compound in the ground, you better make sure that you're not violating somebody's patent out there. And so one of the things that we strongly recommend is that if you're going to use these types of technologies, you go to a technology supplier, because the other side of this is making sure that your formation that you're injecting these materials into is suitable. And so again, if you're using an anaerobic technology and your formation is aerobic and has a high dissolved oxygen, one of the things you're going to have to do is to deplete the oxygen in the formation. Again, we believe these technologies can last longer, 3 to 5 years. And because of the longer effective lifespan, they tend to be less management and more cost effective. And so, again, the microbes eat the chlorinated solvents. The microorganisms belonging to the Dihalococoides have demonstrated their ability to dechlorinate all the way through the ethene. We have a number of sites where we can demonstrate and prove that. However, the specific microorganisms required to achieve complete dechlorination may not be present at the site. I'm going to repeat this one more time because this is critical. Specific microorganisms required to achieve complete dechlorination may not be present at the site. And this is where I go back to the fact we have a lot of chemistry data. I know what the concentration of PCE, TCE. Oh, I see cis and I see a little bit of trans. I might even see some 1,1-DCE. And oh, I see vinyl chloride. Therefore, I must have everything necessary for complete biological degradation of the PCE. And I strongly recommend, and we're going to talk about this just a little bit, that we go out and collect the appropriate data to make sure that the environment is conducive to any sort of anaerobic bioremediation. It's also not uncommon, even when you do an injection, that you hit something that's called stalling. And this is where the degradation process stops midstream. And there's a number of reasons why this happens. One of the things is low numbers of microorganisms. And also that the microorganisms that are present are not the microorganisms that you need to actually continue the degradation process, and that the nutrients are not available there. Also, they could be competing processes that can inhibit the conversion. For example, high levels of bioavailable iron and the conversion of ferric to ferrous forms can interfere with the electron flow. So these competing sources in the environment can slow down, alter, or even stop the degradation process. So what's the solution? Well, first of all, confirmation from appropriate monitoring wells that the degradation process is ongoing. We need to monitor the water quality parameters. I know when we send our technicians out to do the water quality parameters, nobody really looks at that data. It's just for groundwater stability. But in actuality, the dissolved oxygen and the ORP, the oxygen reduction potential, are valuable readings that let us know whether or not we have an environment that's conducive to bioattenuation. Also, we need to monitor degradation parameters, including iron, nitrate, nitrite, sulfate, chloride. There's a lot of wonderful papers out there in the technosphere that can help you understand, or even talk to your microbe supplier to understanding. And the part that we discovered, and I'm just going to say this because we didn't do this from the very beginning. We do it now on all of our sites, whether we're thinking of enhanced bio or not, is we do bioassays. And the bioassays actually help us understand what is actually going on from a biochemistry standpoint in the environment. First of all, is there a sufficient population for reductive dechlorination to occur? And if not, what's missing? The presence and absence of genes responsible for the reductive dechlorination. And if those are missing, what additives or supplements do we need to do? And the other thing we need to do, because sometimes you'll get these sites that stall at DCE, you'll get another site that stalls at vinyl chloride. And again, these assays help you understand the cause or the source. It may just be you got to be patient. And I know when we first got into this, we injected, we didn't see things happen after the first quarter, and we had to go back to the supplier, and the supplier had to say, be patient. We'd go back and we'd start to see something, and the supplier would say, be patient. And it might be 9 months before we really saw the total effects of the bioremediation process. And again, you got to make sure that you're following the recommendations of the supplier themselves, because the bioassay really helps not only with the microbes, but what augmentation that's needed, what nutrients that are needed in the treatment process. And without a proper bioassay, it becomes very, very difficult to manage, in my opinion, to manage a bioremediation project. Let's get into vapor mitigation. There is a lot of press out there today, and I will say that almost all real estate transactions that we're working on that involve dry cleaners, this is a bigger concern than the contaminated groundwater. And why? Because of future building occupant liability. This is a hot ticket item for banks and for lending institutes. And so vapor mitigation, while it's a hot topic in reality, it's something that needs to be addressed from almost the very beginning of the assessment, but we're going to jump into it from the remediation phase. Vapor mitigation, I don't care what EPA guidance document you read on vapor intrusion and vapor mitigation, every single one of them say the best option is to eliminate the source. And the ultimate goal of any vapor mitigation should be to eliminate the source. And that would either be to get rid of the source in soil and or eliminate or reduce the mass in groundwater to where it's no longer a vapor mitigation issue. Okay, now you're saying, Mike, that's impossible. I've got a building sitting on top of this. I can't dig all the mass up. I can't get the groundwater out. So what do I do if I can't achieve the best option? Now what? Well, there are a number of options out there for you. Some sort of vapor barrier or something that interferes with the migration. We've been doing this for years with radon gas. We've implemented systems on homes and buildings that were constructed over sources of radon gas. And we're able to come up with a solution. Our solutions for vapor infiltration for dry cleaners is very similar. And so this would include the use of liners, applied materials, epoxy coatings. Again, I'm not a fan of epoxy coatings as a barrier to prevent the perk from getting out of the dry cleaning machine and into the groundwater because of cracks. I am a fan of using it to minimize the permeability of the concrete to do that. So we have to remember that what is it that we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the amount of surface area that can act as a conveyance for vapors to get into the indoor air. In reality, probably the technology that's going to be most common is some sort of vapor extraction, subslab depressurization. And these are used for existing buildings. Now, the question comes out is, I've torn down the building. What's the best option in that case? Again, the use of vapor barriers. If you can't eliminate the source, this would include flexible membrane liners with passive or active ventilation pipes and vents that will take the material to the surface and exit out the roof. And again, we can use very similar technologies that we would use for radon gas mitigation. So, in summary, before I pass the baton over to Larry, again, I think the most important thing is response actions must be effective. And I think we need to take the time to understand not only the difficulties of remediating the chemicals themselves. Again, chlorinated solvents are a very difficult chemical to remediate. We add on top of that the constraints of a confined dry cleaner space or an overlying shopping center that has neighboring tenants, then it becomes more difficult. I'm reminded of one dry cleaner site that we did where we had a soil excavation, and the soil excavation was about 15 feet deep and went up to and adjacent to a tenant space. And on the other side of one side of the tenant space was a pet store filled with these huge aquariums sitting on the wall. So we had to shore up the wall structure to make sure we didn't have a new swimming pool for all the fish next door. And then we had a Chinese restaurant next door to us, and we had a leaking sanitary sewer line. So we had soup in our excavation, which I'm assuming maybe helped with the bioremediation. But anyway, you need to understand that there's a lot of things that have to be dealt with because of the confined area in which remediation usually takes place. You also need to balance short-term goals with long-term goals. Again, the short-term, I want to get rid of the mass and the source in the soil versus how do I take care of the long-term groundwater response actions. Again, the biggest issues, tight working spaces, small source areas in soil. So why is a small source area in soil an issue? Because I've seen a lot of dry cleaner sites where we never found the source in soil. And why? Because we didn't take samples on a 10-foot grid. I do like the idea of the vapor sampling because it can actually help focus us in on those areas. Groundwater unit issues. Again, addressing the fact of the permeabilities, whether I'm dealing with fractured environments or weathered formations. I find a lot of times in the weathered formations that we create bigger problems just through the installation of our monitoring wells ourselves. And developing a response action strategy that encompasses the source and soil, groundwater, and vapor. I hate to say this, when I got into this business 25, 26 years ago doing dry cleaners, or actually 27 years ago, all we cared about was taking care of groundwater. And then we got into the soil, and today we got to address vapor. You got to address all three of these issues. What I'd like to do now, because you can't do this without considering the legal issues. Larry, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Hey, that was really fascinating. Really interesting. I've been doing this for years, and I learned some things today. So really great. So I'm going to talk about some of the legal issues. I just want to repeat some points that and reemphasize some points that Mike made, and also build off our prior presentations. Remember, from a diligence standpoint, some of the key takeaways we discussed was if there's a present dry cleaner that's drop off, it doesn't mean that there wasn't the they didn't do, it doesn't mean that they didn't do, or it means that it doesn't dismiss the fact that they might have had ongoing or on-site dry cleaning operations in the past. So you want to verify that. We also talked in the past about don't minimize the impact of places called laundries, because they still could have used perk, and the importance of historically whether the property had septic systems or not, because we have a lot of sites that currently are sewered, which again could still be a source of contamination, but septics have been a big source of contamination in the past, and you want to verify if this property previously had septic systems. A lot of the litigation, or at least the discovery of contamination, oftentimes occurs not from discovery from something on site, but you have a property next door doing some work and they start picking up perk. And it's happened a lot, I've seen, with school sites being built, and then suddenly they find there's perk in the groundwater, and lo and behold, there's a former dry cleaner or an existing dry cleaner on the property that you're either buying or bought or you're representing. So it's not just necessarily something you've done or discovered on your site that can trigger a cleanup obligation. It could be something that's discovered next door and the fingers get pointed to your property. And as Mike said, the responsible parties, unlike with gas stations and other types of contaminated sites, the responsible parties with dry cleaners are usually insolvent. They're usually family-owned operations that, you know, went out of business or sold it to someone else, and they just are not free. They don't have any free assets to satisfy a judgment. And the property owners, as a result, are going to get pulled in. And so there's little sources of funding except your own. unless we talk about one of these alternatives in the first slide. And also, to drive the point home, there are probably 200 dry cleaner sites just in New York State that are on the state Superfund list. So the 150 that Mike referenced was just the surplus list, federal, and we were told during the ASTM revision process for 1527, EPA told us that dry cleaners are probably the leading source now of them, and mining sites are probably the leading source of new Superfund sites, because now we have the vapor pathway as a pathway that can be scored. And while the dry cleaner site can be very small, the plume can be very large. And we've had a number of high profile sites. We've had the one in Las Vegas, there's one in Bozeman, there's one in Seagirt, New Jersey, where they all, the dry cleaner plumes are over a mile long, and they come under state, they're going into residential areas and present toxic tort issues. So the pre-remedial decisions, the first thing, if you discover you have contamination sites, you got a couple options. The first thing is, are you going to go through a regulatory program, or you're going to do a self-directed cleanup? If you're looking at a site that had self-directed cleanup, you have to be very careful, because self-directed cleanup means the cleanup was done without any oversight from the regulatory agency. And the reason parties usually do those is because they have time constraints and funding constraints. And particularly now with interest rates so high, the cost to carry a loan for construction is extremely high, and all the incentives are directed towards doing the construction really fast. Self-directed cleanups, you don't know, you have to really determine, because there's no certificate of completion or no further action letter at the end of the day to provide protection to new purchasers. You want to see what did they use to get their regulatory, what essentially was the sign off, or to say that they've done all they have to do. And oftentimes these self-directed cleanups, they're not well characterized, because the owner, the purchaser, the developer does not want to spend a lot of money on investigation. They want to do this as part of their construction schedule. And their remediation might be very limited. So you really have to take a hard look at self-directed cleanups if you do have one that you're encountering. A popular option in some states is to go just enroll the site in the state dry cleaner fund. As Mike said, these are oftentimes very limited, and some of them aren't even available for new sites anymore. Problem with state dry cleaner funds is, because of the funding, they have to triage their funds, and they have historically been directed to give priority to sites that are impacting drinking water. Now, that may have made sense in the early 1990s, but now with the vapor pathway well understood, what that means is you could be buying or lending to a site that has groundwater contamination. It's not being used for drinking water. So the fact that it has a low priority doesn't mean that it doesn't have unhealthy levels or dangerous levels of contaminant. It just means that because they're only focusing on drinking water, that they're going to give a low priority to it. In the meantime, while you're waiting 3 or 4 or 5 years to get your funding, that plume could be migrating across the street and into residential communities, which could expose the property owner to toxic tort liability. So I would, even if you have a low priority, lenders should probably, at the very least, require an environmental insurance product to try to cover for the potential offsite liability. Now, some state programs will eventually give you immunity from offsite liability, but you don't get that till the end. So you have to, look at the program as well. But this is don't be fooled by the fact that the site has a low priority. It does not mean that it doesn't have a high contamination potential. And then when you're doing your pre-decision, you have to decide, what is the future use going to be of your site? Are you going to have a sensitive use like a daycare center, or a place where kids are going to be regularly anticipated to be present? If so, that's going to alter the equation. That might go for that might shift the balance, as Mike was talking about, to a more robust cleanup that's going to, achieve a outcome much earlier. In fact, in some states, you can't have there's all kinds of reporting obligations for dry cleaner sites that are nearby daycare centers. So you have some of these decisions up front that you need to think about. Once you're in the process, I can't emphasize enough the importance of making sure that you determine if your waste is a listed waste or a characteristic waste. I have been involved in situations where the consultant assumed the waste was characteristic when it was listed, and the listed waste was then sent off as a non-hazardous waste to a non-hazardous waste landfill, and my client got fined $1 million or so for violating RCRA. Obviously, the consultant took a hit on that, and they no longer work for that client. But those are the kind of things that you have to consider. If you have a listed waste, no matter what the concentration is, it's still a listed waste. If it passes T-clip, it's still a listed waste. What you can do in that situation is ask for a contained in determination from the state. They will tell you what the treatment standard for your listed waste is. This is principally for soil contamination or just media. If you can, they will give you a contained in determination that if your soil or groundwater samples under a certain number, then you can send it off as non-hazardous. But if you have a listed waste, you want to make sure that you are using, you do contained in determination. Just don't assume it's characteristic and look at the T-clip test. You have to look at your state vapor intrusion requirements. They are highly variable across the state. You also have to think about, some states have what we call these municipal site designations where they kind of pretend the groundwater doesn't exist. If the groundwater doesn't exist, then you don't have to worry about the perc in the groundwater, and you can get closure. I've had sites in states that got closure that would have been considered red hot in California or New York. So again, as a lender, even though the site might get closure under a state but has a municipal site designation, I might still want to get insurance or require some additional work to take into account the potential human exposures. Even if the state itself, because of the way its program is set up, doesn't necessarily be concerned about that. Some states have notification requirements when you get vapor results. So New York, for example, has one. And I said New Jersey has one for dry cleaners and daycare. You want to double check. Vapor intrusion sampling by itself under federal law should not probably be disclosable, because you don't have a quantity, a reportable quantity, which usually expressed in terms of parts per million or micrograms per liter. The way that vapor intrusion is expressed is probably not, and it's historical in nature, so it's probably not going to be reportable federally, but it might be under state. And obviously, if you have to respond to your state, start notifying your state, your adjacent landowners, that's raising a risk of toxic suits. Even if you have a remediation that's been completed under oversight, the key is to make sure that you comply with the appropriate care requirements. Remember, a phase 1 and remediation only gets you're able to qualify for the prospective purchaser or the bona fide prospective purchaser defense. The problem is holding and maintaining your defense, which means you have to comply with post appropriate care and due care requirements. Some states have due care requirements, like Michigan has a great due care program. You put a plan into place, but as a lender, I might want my borrower to actually put into place a post due care remediation program, so I know that they can use that as a defense to liability. Obviously, lender concerns are going to be the adequacy of the cleanup, of the toxicity exposure, and sometimes actually when there's no offsite sampling, I might just tell the lender to go get an insurance policy instead of doing phase 2 offsite, because once you get sampling results, it's no longer a fortuity in terms of insurance. It's a known condition and it's hard to get coverage. So from a lender standpoint, not sorry, property owner standpoint, sometimes insurance is a better way to go instead of just doing sampling offsite to see if the contamination's gone offsite. And you have to really look at your, if you're buying a property that used to have a dry cleaner, or you're selling it, you want to make sure you have good contractual protection so that down the road, either you don't get sued by your purchaser for contamination that you were unaware of as a former owner, or by an adjacent property owner. And you may want to be able to sell, if you get sued, you may want to, maybe you want to, as part of negotiation, passed off the liability to your purchaser. So you have to think about contract issues as well. We could go spend a whole day on this, but I just wanted to raise these points. So I see we're at 1:55. We have a couple good questions in the queue. So Scott, I guess you're going to handle it from here.
Yeah, we'll turn over to the questions right now. So we're going to allow about 10 minutes for questions. So we might go over 5 minutes over the hour. Remember, please enter your questions in the Q&A section of the platform, and then we'll go through as many as we can before our time is up. Mike and Larry have both agreed to answer any unanswered questions that we'll send out later on. So let's go ahead to the first one. So have you seen agency resistance to soil excavation? In California, the Department of Toxic Substance Control Act or Control is starting to disfavor excavation to bow to the environmental justice pressure since they don't want the problem moved to impact an offsite low-income area. Any observations?
So I'll address that in a couple of different ways. So the answer that I've encountered with soil remediation or moving soil offsite, because commonly it's used if the levels are low enough as daily cover for landfills. That's the most common use for soil, but it's got to be treated down to a level that's suitable for that use. Now, taking the soil and moving it to another site, there's a lot of resistance to that in the fact that you're potentially moving contaminant mass from one place to another. I'm not 100% sure I fully understand the question, but in most states, movement of contaminated mass from one location to another location is discouraged unless those levels are well below residential standards. There are some exemptions, but I've also been involved in several litigation cases where that soil was moved, and even though the levels were below residential, there is a new state overseeing removal action to get all that soil off of neighborhoods where they were moved. So yes, I've seen a lot of pressure not to allow that outside of landfills. I've not seen a lot into landfills as long as the landfills are permitted or allowed to accept that material, because they use it typically as daily cover over the waste material.
I've seen it a lot in the New York Brownfield program. It's not just environmental justice communities, it's also high-end communities.
Yeah.
They don't want trucks. So there's usually a split in the community. On the one hand, there's a group that doesn't want trucks going through their neighborhood with dirt and the noise. One way to accommodate the dirt problem is to make sure the trucks are properly covered. So they are objecting to excavation. They want the soil to be kept in place as much as possible. Yeah. On the other hand, there are people that want all of the dirty dirt to get out of the site. And so the environmental regulator and the redeveloper, brownfield person, they are caught in the middle. And what this results usually in is extended and very complicated public participation process where you know, if you have I have a site now where it would be a 45-day comment period, it's turned into 6 months. And you can't start your remedy until you get the approval. And the community is this is a very educated community. Then you have environmental justice areas where they already have lots of impacts and they don't want additional impacts of trucks with their exhaust, and they're done. So yes, it's a real problem. It can be a real problem.
Okay, next question, anaerobic. So how much concern for VC after breakthrough the DCE stall? Agency vapor intrusion concerns?
So I'm gonna kind of answer that question. I think that's being asked. So when we're out there doing remediation and it's stalled at DCE and we go and we do some modification and now all of a sudden we're creating vinyl chloride. But we also have sites that stall at vinyl chloride, make it through DCE and stall at vinyl chloride. And so, yes, the accumulation of vinyl chloride, the two drivers for vapor intrusion are usually vinyl chloride and TCE and or trichloroethylene. So those are the ones that you're dealing with. So if you have a site where that becomes an issue, it is not uncommon that you have to address that potential. Now, my experience is vinyl chloride is a lot easier to remedy than the DCE. So even though you might have a very short-term spike in vinyl chloride, it generally goes away pretty quick. So we haven't found a lot of sort of long-term concern, because usually by the time you're arguing over whether it's a concern or not, the vinyl chloride concern is naturally taking care of itself through the system. So I'm less concerned about the vinyl chloride as I am about the TCE and the DCE stall. But yeah, it does become a concern because of its low standard exposure level.
Mike, is that one way that petroleum sites are different from dry cleaner sites, and the fact that as time goes on, the dry cleaner site actually may get more dangerous for health because of the way the degradation works?
Yeah, vinyl chloride is a chemical that our standards were based originally on technology, not on health-based limits. So the vinyl chloride cleanup standards were based on the ability of the lab to detect it in the sample. But now the air inhalation standards are generally driven down to the lower levels. So now we have much more stringent criteria for it, and also for trichloroethylene as well.
Okay, next question. What are the primary guidelines for conducting bench scale bioremediation tests for chlorinated solvents?
Okay, fortunately, there's a lot of good documents out there on this. I strongly recommend you pull some of those down. The other thing I strongly recommend is whoever you're thinking about buying the microbes from, they are not the ones that do your test. You want to go to an independent lab and you want to have things verified. And I typically would look for, you would typically look for a lab that specializes in doing treatability studies, and they can help you set them up. So the things that we're looking at are sort of two factors. So we look at the biomarkers that we talked about, and along with it, and then we look at the some sort of treatability study. Generally, bench scale studies are not as effective as in situ, because you can have a bench scale study that does very well and then it doesn't work out in the real. So I like small pilot studies over bench scale studies, but it's a cost thing, a cost balance.
Larry, this is for you. Can you do self-directed cleanup in New York State?
Yeah, so it's not prohibited. So yes, you can do a self-directed cleanup. And I've seen people, businesses putting up drugstores and other things that they just figure they're going to do a cleanup. And then if they get caught, they'll just ask for forgiveness. New York City's OER, it can be a problem when you have a lender when you're going to refinance. The lender wants to know how did you adequately clean up your site. OER, the New York City Office of Environmental Remediation, has what we call a look back program, so that if you do a site self-directed and your lender wants a piece of paper from an agency, OER has a program that they'll give you a piece of paper. You may have to do some additional sampling to verify that the soils and groundwater meet the standards, but none of the work that was done self-directed would ever be accepted by New York State and many other states. But this look back program, you can do some additional sampling. So the answer is, it is It's not prohibited, but it's disfavored. And in New York, because of the brownfield program, if you're going to be putting up any kind of development, you're going to get enormous tax credits. So it's actually worthwhile to do it under oversight.
Okay. Most lenders don't feel comfortable with environmental insurance due to several factors. Could you highlight the downside of environmental insurance?
I don't necessarily agree with that assessment. There are lender policies that don't have a lot of the same exclusions as what I would call legal liability policy. The lender policies, they tend to like, but like anything else, it's a contract. It has limited terms. So it could be for 7 or 10 years for a limit of $1, $2, $5, $10 million, whatever. So obviously, if the cleanup is exceeding, they used to be lesser of, which meant the lesser of the cleanup cost or the loan balance. Now they just tend to focus on the cleanup. So for that, and the question that, will the insurer stand behind their product? They've actually been pretty good so far, because if they don't, they'll get reputational risk, and people are looking for premium now so they can get their 7%. So I would say that for offsite liability, it's a good product. It's going to be harder for onsite if you have known conditions. And if the borrower is going to be added to the policy, then it's probably going to have to be a legal liability with deductions and other potential exclusions. A pure lender policy doesn't have those generally.
Okay.
Scott, can we move down? There's one question I'd like to try to answer.
Which
and it's
one?
the one that says, do you have insight on using chemical oxidation for soil and groundwater treatment? We're working on 2 PCE impacted sites, tried bioremediation on one with poor results, and are now considering chemical treatment for the other. So I'm going to say in both situations, you need to make sure that the implementation is suitable to the technology. And so for bio in soil, that's very difficult because it's a balance of moisture and nutrients that you mix into the soil. A lot of time the soil dries out and you have problems managing that. Chemical oxidation, on the other hand, we've had a lot of success. But again, it's getting the chemical oxidant into the soil. And so a lot of the times for the chemical oxidation to be successful, the soil needs to be excavated. And this is where it becomes a fine line between triggering a treatment facility and treating it as part of the in situ process. So placement is usually not triggered unless you move the soil far away from the source of generation. So we tend to prefer chemical oxidation in the soil when you can. If it's under the building, it's very difficult to do, but we prefer to do chemical oxidation and blend in the chemical oxidants along with a few other products like lime to help with the oxidation process, and then replace that soil back into the excavation. And we've had a lot of success doing that. With bio, it's all time. You got to allow the time, and you got to manage the moisture.
Scott, I can answer 2 questions really quickly because I know we're getting close to the end here. With respect to listed versus characteristic, EPA has tables in Part 261. It identifies listed waste. There's 4 categories. There's like F waste, P waste, U wastes. So the listed waste are either certain types of contaminants, wastes that are per se listed, or they're by certain waste streams generated by businesses. So you go look through the lists and see if it's there. And then there's also a table for characteristic waste, which is the number you have to meet in order to be considered to exit the Subtitle C program and just handle it as non-hazardous. With respect to, are there still businesses that are buying distressed properties? Absolutely, yes. Particularly in New York, we have enormous tax credits. This is like Seinfeld Bizarre World, where It's the opposite of what you should think it is. So in the old days, contamination was a bad thing. Nowadays, it's a good thing because you're going to get tax credits. I have sites that get into the brownfield program and then get flipped for more money before the cleanup because they're now going to have tax credits. So I don't know. There have been some companies that have not properly managed their sites and have gone out of business. There's one high profile one in Colorado right now that's going belly up. But there's still a market for these sites to go into brownfield programs and redevelop them. But again, it's going to be based on location, location, location.
All right.
Look, there's two questions. Y'all want to try to answer those real quick?
We can, if we still have listeners.
Yeah, you do. If we can just kind of hit those and then after that we will conclude. But go ahead. You got the regarding getting insurance prior to sampling.
Yeah, there's a lot of detailed insurance questions. I think that's better to do offline.
Okay.
Because there's other issues here that Mike can answer generically. I think.
Right. We can do that. All right, we'll go ahead and do that. So as of now, we'll go ahead and conclude this webinar. So, hey, great presentation discussion, but we're out of time. To read more about dry cleaning, commercial real estate, or environmental and property assessment, please visit ERIS Info Hub on erisinfo.com, which contains curated articles, podcasts, webinars on these topics, and recordings from past webinars. Additionally, this is where you can also go back and see part 1 and part 2 of this series. So at ERIS Info Hub on erisinfo.com. Also, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the ERIS website in the next few days. As many of you know, this is the last installment of our special 3-part series on dry cleaning. So on behalf of ERIS and our audience, we'd like to give a big thank you to Mike and Larry and sharing their immense expertise and insight with us today and their work on these series. For our audience, we want to thank you for your attention in the past hour. We look forward to hosting you at our next ERIS webinar. So be on the lookout for the email blast and social post. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, y'all.
Thank y'all.